Here. Bill Falsey.
Patrick Flynn. Bill Evans.
Pete Peterson.
Elvis Regan.
Dick Gray.
Forrest Dunbar.
Amy Kimbowski.
Dennis Wheeler.
Erica McConnell. Thank you. Ms. McConnell, I think you're going to be representing. You have the floor.
Thank you. I've handed out two documents. One is a PowerPoint, and the other is a document that is staff responses to the industry comments. I believe the Assembly and the Planning and Zoning Commission received 3 letters, one from BCI, one from a firm representing Verizon, and one from another firm representing AT&T. And what I tried to do is pull out their verbatim, their comments, and provide a staff response. So you'll see that they are listed 1 through 14. And I will touch on kind of the ones that I consider to be the major ones that we disagreed upon by the industry. The ones that I consider to be major, I touched on in the PowerPoint. So we could turn to slide 1. You may recall that about a month ago, I did a work session for the body on the major elements of the S version, and that was this kind of blue work session I think we did upstairs in the mayor's conference room. And I can provide copies of that. I've tried to hand them out to the new members who were not seated at that time, but I can provide copies to anyone else who might want one. So in this PowerPoint, I'm just going to touch on the changes that were recommended by the Planning and Zoning Commission, which are incorporated into the S version, and then touch on some of the major comments by the administration. So on page, I guess after the title page, so page 2 of the PowerPoint, the Planning and Zoning Commission recommended a number of changes to the use tables. They did recommend, so the use tables are split between the principal use table and the accessory use table. So in residential districts, generally, towers are only allowed as accessory uses, so those are mostly in the accessory use table. But in the principal use table, so where a tower would be allowed on a vacant piece of property or as a second principal use along with some other type of principal use, the P&Z recommended allowing type 1 towers, which are your monopole towers, to be in the RO, the residential office, and the PLI, which is public lands and institution, by conditional use. Also in the PLI, they recommended type 2 towers, which are your lattice towers, to be allowed by, or to require a conditional use review rather than just an administrative site plan review. In the RO district, they recommended removing your type 3 tower as an allowed use. These are towers that are held up by guide towers. In the Parks and Recreation district, they recommended requiring a conditional use for type 1 and 2 towers instead of an administrative site plan review, removing type 3 towers as an allowed use, and requiring an administrative site plan review for type 4 towers. Type 4 are your concealed towers, your stealth or camouflage towers. They also recommended making the Girdwood Resort District regulations similar to the residential district regulations, and to make changes within both the Girdwood use table and the Chugiak Eagle River use tables to be consistent with the changes that I just went through in the acreage total use table. Moving to page 3, Planning and Zoning Commission recommended that large concealed antennas be allowed to be accessory to multifamily structures with at least 7 dwelling units. Before that change, large antennas would only be allowed to be accessory to non-residential uses within residential districts, such as churches, utilities, substations, that sort of thing. And so they recommended that if you have a large multifamily structure, that you could also put a concealed antenna on that structure. They recommended adding a standard for equipment lighting. There's already a standard for tower lighting, which relates to the flashing light that you see at the top of the tower, which is usually only placed there when it's required by the FAA. But the equipment lighting, so the ground-mounted equipment, they recommended that lighting of that equipment be directed towards the ground, not cause glare or light trespass off the property, and in residential districts and within 150 feet of residential districts, remain off when there are no personnel on the site. They recommended to clarify that the conditional use process can be used to request, not only request to exceed the standards that are provided in code, but also to request a tower type that otherwise would not be permitted in the district. So, for example, there are no type 2 towers allowed in residential districts, but through the conditional use process, you could request to have a type 2 tower if you could prove why you needed that type 2 tower and no other type of tower could accommodate you. So they just wanted to make sure that was certainly the intent, that they wanted to have that clarified. And that was done both in the text and as footnotes to the tables. They wanted a clarification that the size limitation of a small antenna, and this is where we're talking about small cell or distributed antenna systems, that the size limitation is per antenna rather than counting for the whole antenna array, and this is consistent with the FCC definition. And page 4, P&Z recommended that, so you may recall that we proposed that all towers must be constructed to be able to accommodate 3 different antenna arrays, which will allow for co-location. However, in residential districts, the maximum height of a tower is 65 feet. And so if you consider you have a 10 to 20 foot separation between antenna arrays, it doesn't really make sense to require 3 arrays when you're starting at 65 feet. So your second array is going to be somewhere around 45 or 50 feet, and your third array is going to be down at 15 or 20 feet. That doesn't really make any sense. So they recommended that in residential districts, when you have towers that are less than 85 feet tall, that they would only have to accommodate 2 antenna arrays. And we do occasionally see antennas located at the 45-foot level. It's not completely unheard of, although it's also not common. Another recommendation was for towers proposed along the Turnagain Arm in the Seward Highway National Scenic Corridor, in significant view sheds that include street level view sheds, which you might see in historic districts, and at community gateways, the decision-making body must have a finding that the tower does not significantly affect the scenic corridor, the view shed, or the gateway. And this would be a way to protect those portions of our community that are visually very significant. And then the bottom recommendation on this page would be to remove a standard. This comes from the definition of what, or the definition of what would make a concealed tower. And the language said, by itself, paint schemes on the support structure or telecommunications facility are not presumptively sufficient to classify a concealed facility, but the director may determine that a paint scheme is enough to achieve the required concealment. And the Planning and Zoning Commission recommended deleting that language. Turning to page 5, this is the last page of commission recommendations. They recommended, so you may recall our discussion of separation from protected land uses. There are certain types of uses that are designated as protected from which towers would have to be separated. That list includes residential structures, schools, child care facilities, and any principal structure on PLI zone land. Well, principal structures on PLI zone land can really run the gamut, but you have a lot of things that are just office buildings, such as the permit center. So they recommended, which, why would an office building on PLI get any more protection than an office building on B3? So they recommended removing any principal structure on PLI zone land as a protected land use from which a tower must be separated. Also on the subject of protected land uses, they recommend that if the property owner or owners, as the case may be, of the protected land uses have no objection and agree, then the separation distance can be reduced just using that criteria from 200% of the allowed tower height or the actual tower height, whichever is greater, down to 150%. So all it would take is the property owner of the protected land use saying, yeah, that's okay. To go down further than 150% to 110%, there's a list of entities that the decision-making body has to the community council, the owner of the tower property, and the applicant themselves, which is usually either the provider or a tower company. And they added the property owner of the protected land use to the list of entities that should be considered when they're looking at going down to 110% of the separation distance. So those are all of the recommendations that were made by the Planning and Zoning Commission. They are incorporated into the S version that's in front of you. Moving on to page 6, again, I pulled out what felt to me like the major industry comments. A big one was removing the extension, that the industry has requested the removal of the extension of the residential standards into non-residential zones within 150 feet of residential zones. Staff does not entirely support this. We feel that so the standards we're talking about are tower type, so you'd be having a concealed tower or a small cell facility within 150 feet of residential zones. You would have fencing and landscaping requirements, and you would have a height limit. So of those things, staff thinks it would be reasonable to maybe consider allowing a higher height within 150 feet of residential zones, but would not recommend allowing a different tower type or removing the fencing and landscaping requirements. And I can point out where in the draft those issues are if it would help. On page 7, the industry had concerns with the required half-mile separation between towers. We've seen several locations where you have 2 towers that are on the same property or on properties that are right next to each other, each holding up maybe one antenna array. And if we have a requirement that each tower has to be able to support 3 arrays, we want to encourage that to be used and not to have a proliferation of towers. So we did propose that there be a half-mile separation distance between towers, but we recognize, helped by industry comment, that this is not always going to be achievable, particularly at the beginning where you have a lot of existing towers that may not be able to, because they weren't engineered to, they may not be able to support a second or a third array. So we've proposed an amendment that would allow, through the decision-making process, without having to jump into the conditional use process, it would allow the decision-making body to hear that, for some particular reasons that they can't achieve that half-mile separation and need to be allowed to be closer.
Mr. Flynn?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Erica, did I hear you say that one consideration for not requiring co-location was insufficient engineering of the tower?
Correct. There are towers constructed today that are engineered and constructed that can only accommodate one antenna array.
But this would be for new towers, primarily.
The separation distance would apply to existing towers.
Okay, so you're saying if we have an existing tower that's not engineered to handle more than 1 array or more than 2 arrays, then we might waive the half-mile for another tower.
Yes, that would be one reason.
Is there a requirement in here that they're at least engineered to accommodate 3 arrays?
Yes, from now on, new towers from now on would have to be built, assuming this is adopted as written, they would have to be built to accommodate at least 3 arrays unless they're in residential districts less than 85 feet, and then it would only be 2.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Please continue.
Another issue was retaining a height incentive for co-location, and this is something that we've discussed a lot. In the code today, there is a provision that says if you are providing co-location, you can get an extra 15 feet of height per co-location up to a maximum of 30 feet above the base height that's allowed in the district. The problem is that the industry has said that they cannot guarantee that the co-location will be provided for a variety of reasons, one of which is an uncertainty in the length of time it will take to actually permit and construct the tower based on the approval process and potential appeals. So if they can't guarantee that there actually will be co-location on that tower, then we would be in the situation of providing extra height for no benefit to the municipality. We also discussed whether, if they do get that extra height and then there is no co-location, whether the height could then be taken off, and that really wasn't something that was found palatable either. So we sort of found ourselves at an impasse, and so we took out the provision about getting extra height for co-location. We would be happy to put it back in, except we're told that it won't be used. The industry would like, based on their comments, they would like to have extra height based on the opportunity for co-location. But again, if we have no clue whether it will ever actually be used, is there a justification for providing extra height? So that was a pretty sticky issue.
I'd like to take a moment to recognize that Assemblymember Crawford has joined us.
And then, a final issue, again, that this is not all of the industry issues, but the one that felt it was mentioned multiple times was the dimensional requirements for small cell installations. And as I understand it, the issue is the size of the equipment when located in the right-of-way. We have the same antenna size as the FCC definition, and for when equipment, so we're talking about the base station sort of thing, when it's located outside of the right-of-way on an easement on property, our allowance for size is much larger than the FCC definition, but when it's located in the right-of-way, our allowance was much smaller. So within the list of the written documentation of responses, I've offered an amendment that would allow the FCC size of equipment in the right-of-way with some protections for the pedestrian facilities, so that it couldn't intrude into existing pedestrian facilities or cause a problem for potential future pedestrian facilities if it's located in an area where either the code or the comprehensive plan would call for pedestrian facilities. So there would be rural areas where you wouldn't ever anticipate pedestrian facilities, and then it wouldn't be a problem. But if you have a power pole and you have, say, 5 feet or 7 feet to the edge of the right-of-way, which is where you would put a sidewalk in the future, you couldn't put the equipment right there, so that you could never, or you either have to move it or you could never get a sidewalk through that area. So that was the intent of the language that's proposed. Those are the things that I wanted to particularly highlight for you. Again, we did provide a written response to all of the comments that were raised by the industry in the letters that were most recently received. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I have a suggestion, if you don't mind, since we have another hour and 10 minutes. Would you mind going over the responses to the industry's questions to
Sure.
some extent? Thank you. Mr. Middleton.
I had a couple on this. Should I hit
Oh,
that
okay,
now?
I'm sorry, I didn't see your
No,
hand.
it's okay.
Mr. Middleton.
One thing, Erica, it says in here residential districts towers less than 85 feet, but residential, they're capped at 65. How's that?
But you can use the conditional use process to request more height.
And so 85 would be the max.
Nope.
Or you could go even higher.
You could go even higher. You could request a higher height.
And then, this half-mile separation, I was looking at that because we have requirements to co-locate if we can co-locate. With all the other requirements, it seems like, I couldn't see why that was necessary. I mean, there are cases where if you had a gap in service, if you had to have, within that half mile you had a gap in service, then they can say, hey, we got a gap in service, we can put a tower here, you can't stop it. If they can co-locate, they have to co-locate. So it seems like the half mile of that's another stumbling block with no real benefit. Did I miss something?
Well, I think if you look at this document, the old PowerPoint, you can see on page, oh gosh, I don't have page numbers. But it's this page here, it's about right in the middle. You can see 3 different examples where we have multiple towers that are either on the same lot or very close to each other. On the right side, these are 2 towers that are on the same lot. In the middle, so these are on Muldoon. The middle picture is the lattice tower that's at the corner of Boniface and DeBar, and there's another monopole right behind it. I think they're on adjacent lots. And then the left picture is down behind the Jewel Lake Bowl, where there's 2 towers on adjacent lots, and then right behind me across the street there was a 3rd tower. These are constructed by right in commercial districts, and so there is nobody checking to push and require co-location. So by requiring a separation, you're going to require, you're going to reduce the number of towers that are clustered together.
Is there anyone from the industry here? So, can I ask something?
Third industry relation.
If it's cheaper to co-locate than to build a tower, and if you can show, so there's a big incentive to not do what was done there. If you can show that co-locating costs more than building a tower, then you're allowed. Isn't it always, should be way cheaper to co-locate? So if you got why would you have 2 next to each other on Jewel Lake, like that one on Jewel Lake Road? How would that happen?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what the specific reason was for that, but that specific situation happened. In general, you're correct. In general, co-location is much cheaper and is preferable for all parties involved. And in general, I mean, we would agree with your assessment that with the requirement that co-location be considered the first alternative, it does seem redundant to also require the blanket half-mile radius requirement. I don't know if you want to add to that, Ken.
I think there are, however, legitimate reasons why co-location may not work. For example, your tower is just under a half-mile away and it doesn't meet your service gap, or there's
There's an FAA restriction on any height in that neighborhood area. I mean, I could see a few nuanced situations where there would be completely impossible.
The tower may also not be engineered to stand the weight of another array, so there may be a height requirement restriction, or just the way the tower is engineered. In order to get 3 segments of antennae material second, that's a lot more expensive.
But so you would only build a tower if there were a gap in service. You don't just do it on top. So, but isn't that if there's a gap in service, they get to do what they want? That was kind of the gist of this whole thing.
They have to prove that their needs can't be met in any other way.
And even if that meant they were a quarter mile there, that's 800 feet or 20 feet.
Thank you, Mr. Middleton. It's kind of after the fact, but this meeting's being taped, so I would appreciate it if the industry, if all of you would identify who you are. Thank you. We'll start with you.
Sure. David Boylston, Verizon Wireless. Ted Lyons, Bush Law Firm on behalf of AT&T.
Becky McPherson, GCI.
Sean Ashman of AT&T.
And Ms. Yellen, the line.
Patsy Lamar, Verizon Wireless.
Thank you. Please continue.
Okay, starting on page 1 of the response to industry comments on AO 2015, 2042, not 2016. Apologies. We already discussed number 1, which is the extension of residential zoning into non-residential areas. We discussed number 2. At the bottom of page 1, you can see the proposed amendment to the separation distance.
One moment, Mr. Evans.
Yeah, I just had a quick question on number 2. I see that the language kind of mirrors pretty much the Spokane exception that was written into their code. The one phrase in it that I just was wondering what the intention was behind was to the satisfaction of the decision-making body. It wasn't included in the Spokane amendment or exception. Just wondered why we added it here and what we intend that to mean.
That the decision-making body would have to feel that sufficient information was provided and that it was that sufficient information was provided to show that their case.
I just the lawyerly concern that this standard's basically saying the standard is you have to satisfy the decision-making body. So if this was ever appealed to a court or anything, the decision-making body can just say I wasn't satisfied, regardless of what the evidence was. It seems like a better approach, and I'm looking at Dennis, but would be some sort of, as reasonably demonstrated, or something that could be a standard that would be reviewed by a court more easily than satisfying the bottom. That's just for your consideration. I think that might be
Sure,
better.
through the chair, Mr. Evans, you certainly could rephrase that to a reasonable person standard.
If you could do that, I would appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Gurley. Mr. Evans, please continue.
Okay, turning the page, we've discussed the co-location height incentive. Number 4, the changes to the use table. Some of these changes were actually made, so there's kind of 4 sub requests. And sub request number 3 was recommended by the Planning and Zoning Commission. Number 1, because you can apply by conditional use for a type 1 tower in these districts anyway, we felt like this was not appropriate. I think the real issue here is the conditional use standard that needs to be met. And so there's a slightly higher standard if it's not actually listed in the table as a conditional use. But in our, one of the main purposes of, or one of the main structural characteristics of this ordinance is that in residential districts, we're looking for either concealed towers or small cell type of installation. And so to provide an easier opt-out for a type 1 tower through a regular conditional use process was felt to somewhat defeat the purpose. But again, that option is still there if for some reason they can't provide either a concealed tower or a small cell installation. Sub request number 2 is about whether or not to use vacant residential lots to construct towers. As far as I could tell, looking back at code, since 1999, we've not allowed towers on vacant lots in residential districts. So they've always had to be, or since then, they've had to be accessory to some other type of use. And while I don't know what the thinking was back then, I can imagine today that we would not want to basically take away the capacity for housing to be on that vacant lot by putting a tower there. So we didn't support that change. And number 4, the PLI zone, while I did talk that you often do see office buildings, you actually see a wide variety of uses there, and those lands can be very community sensitive, so we didn't feel that it was appropriate to necessarily allow all tower types, although, again, you can apply by conditional use for all of the different tower types. Moving on to number 5, the changes that were requested were actually made by the Planning and Zoning Commission for the separation distance. Number 6 I discussed already. Number 7, clarifying the treatment of power pole extensions. So the definition of a type 1 tower, which is your monopole, includes a utility pole with 1 or more telecommunications facilities is a type 1 tower unless it meets the requirements of ADAP, which are the small cell requirements. So basically, the request was to basically allow, as far as I understood it, to allow large antennas to be considered on power poles as concealed towers. And basically, if a large antenna is proposed to be concealed on a utility pole, then the utility pole would not be considered a tower. So there's nothing to prevent a concealed antenna, a large antenna, so not a small cell, but a large antenna to be put onto a utility pole. So we did not feel like a change was necessary.
Mr. Quinn?
Okay, this kind of gets close to home here. What I think I hear you saying is if a cell company wanted to put a large antenna array on the utility pole next to my house, that's permitted use and it's not considered a single monopole.
Only if it's concealed, so that it meets the standards that are on page 15 that talk about being integrated as an architectural feature of an existing structure and or designed and so built that the purpose of the facility for providing wireless services is not readily apparent to the casual observer.
Does that even exist? I mean,
No, that's the way it would be now.
does that even exist? I mean, granted, there's a lot of wires on my pole, but I have a hard time understanding what you could put on there that would be
I think it would be
unobservable.
difficult to do on a utility pole for a large antenna.
Okay, may I ask, do you guys have anything like that?
We don't have anything presently, but the point of our comment was, and I think part of this sort of a little bit of confusion is exactly our point, that it's not totally clear where we would go with a macro antenna site on an existing utility pole, which is concealed within a sheath, so that it's made to look like an extension of the pole, which I feel like we've seen a number of images throughout the process of this ordinance of those types of sheath antenna structures located on light poles, but we have more utility poles than we have light poles in this community that are options for this kind of extension. So the question is just, and previously anything when a utility pole became a type 1 tower, so now it sounds like it would be considered a concealed antenna or a type 4 tower. What we're looking for really is clarity of direction. What is it? And I think if it's definitely a concealed antenna located on an existing structure, I think that works. It's just a matter of, is that clear in the code? It sounds like maybe it isn't, because we're having this discussion.
Well, to follow up on that, I mean, this isn't the one outside my house, but in one of the neighborhoods I represent, there was a lot of concern about adding to the height of utility pole to put an array up. And if by this we're saying, okay, you can add 6 feet and put a sheath around it, that's not going to make the neighborhood very happy. They're already concerned about the existence of the current pole. So I guess I'm a little bit troubled. I mean, if it's on the body of the pole currently, I don't see a problem there. But if it's extending the height of the pole, then it seems to me we're going in a different realm.
Anything else, Mr. Flynn?
No,
Thank you, Mr. Flynn.
something maybe for
Mr. Wheeler?
Thank you through the chair, Mr. Flynn. That is part of why the test is what is noticeable or observable like a common individual, a reasonable person. There may be poles that are tall enough or shaped such, transmission lines, poles perhaps, large light poles, not just your traditional smaller backyard electrical utility pole that might have a fairly large antenna array that's concealed in some fashion, so it's not just a spread eagle kind of thing, but more of a canister shape. That your eye would not be attracted to that because of the pole's height and the other equipment that's already on it. Whereas in your example, the backyard one, there may not be very much you can do with a large or a macro antenna to really convince people there's nothing there.
All right, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. Please continue.
Okay, flexibility in concealment, criteria number 8. We have no objection to reviving this language. What we had envisioned, you may recall, I tried to put it in the PowerPoint for today, but of course it's in black and white, so it's not very clear. But I think we've showed you a couple times the picture of the antenna on the church, which of course is not in Anchorage, but the antenna or antenna sheet is painted in a brick-like fashion to match the church, and thus that makes it very not visible. So we felt that here would be a situation where paint was sufficient to achieve the intent of the concealment standards. So we felt that that was a reasonable language to provide.
Mr. Evans?
I didn't want to. I actually wanted to back up for 1 second. I had just a concern about the pedestrian walkway clearance for the small cell stuff. And I understand that you're a planner, so we pay you to look forward, and make sure we're not creating problems for ourselves down the road. And I appreciate this, but we have also so many plans, at least that I'm aware of, that where we have like proposed pedestrian areas that have been there for 20 years on the plans and never have turned into anything. I'm just a little concerned that if we, restrict this to places where there might be in some plan a future pedestrian area, we're cutting out a lot of areas where we could have this useful technology, and it might never be in the way of anything. And I don't know how exactly to bridge those two concerns, but if you could give that some thought, because I think it may be just a little too restrictive if something is on a plan as a potential. If we were really good at following up all our plans and doing exactly what we said, that would be, your idea would make sense, but I'm a little concerned that a lot of our plans, maybe more than half, especially in pedestrian and areas, just never come to fruition. So.
I guess the two thoughts I would have with response would be, one, that I don't think this would prevent the whole system from being put in place, because you would still have the option of moving onto property. So, if you didn't have enough space in the right of way where you would be blocking a potential pedestrian facility, you could move it out of the right of way. Alternately, there could be a provision stating that should the municipality or a developer ever come in to build a sidewalk, that the equipment would have to be moved at the expense of the equipment owner.
It's something along those, it's something along those lines, or inserting the word likely, so that the decision-making body can look and say, well, we've had this plan here for 20 years and nothing's happened at this point. It's not likely that this is going to occur in the future. Give some flexibility to that. Would be great.
Thank you,
I
Mr.
like the move if at your own expense option. That's pretty clean.
That's one vote for move at your own expense option.
We should plan to look at the plan. Please continue.
I'm on number 9. Definition of small cell, I think we touched on that above. Number 10, I'm going to let Dennis talk about.
Okay. What is it? Oh, right. Well, this is where I think we've said several times, both the industry and myself, that we agree to disagree, or we disagree that we disagree. I don't know. Essentially, my opinion is that case law supports the notion that if we're looking to analyze their modification, there are certain requirements that they have to meet, even though they essentially have, in large sense, a free pass on that modification. There's still some requirements. For example, they need to meet the requirement that it's still a concealed tower, if that's the notion. So in that body of work, I think it's fair to ask about whether there's other alternatives, including whether there's other technical alternatives. It's a case-specific analysis. It's not a blanket requirement or a blanket ban, if you will, or a blanket position that they always have to use that alternative technology, or that you would say no based on a particular judgment you bring to the table, right? There's an exchange of information and you make a decision based on that as to whether it qualifies. The industry relies on a Second Circuit case. I don't think the Second Circuit case is binding. I think the Ninth Circuit decisions give us the flexibility to address this issue in the manner that we have. So that's kind of where we are. So we have lawyers fighting over some case law knowledge.
Thank you. Mr. Bosky, did you read?
Okay, number 11, I think we touched on in the PowerPoint. Oh, no, I'm sorry, we didn't fully touch on it. There's a concern that the 200% separation distance is not valid, or is only valid because it is a sort of backdoor way to get at concerns about health effects of radio frequency emissions, which we are not allowed, as a local jurisdiction, we're not allowed by federal law to continue to consider. However, I don't think that is the case. I think there are valid reasons for separation distance, including safety. I'm not particularly concerned about tower collapse, but it's not out of the realm of possibility, but also elements of antennas falling off, being blown off, getting so much ice on them that they come off. And then also for the aesthetic purposes, these are large structures, and to have them very close to people's homes is not comfortable. So we continue to believe that a separation distance is appropriate and is certainly something that we see in a lot of other jurisdictions. Mr. Evans?
Oh, if I understood correctly, Erica, I think you were saying that it would be okay to have something within that separation distance if it met, I guess you're okay with the extended height, but as long as it met the landscaping and other requirements. Is that,
Well, so the scheme is that you start with a separation distance of 200% of either the allowed tower height or the actual tower height, whichever is greater. If, and these are from your protected land uses, so your principal residential structures, so not sheds, but your main residential structures, your schools, and your childcare facilities. If, so say you're within 200, or you're 200% from just one home, and you talk to that homeowner and you say, well, we'd really like to be closer, we'd like to be within 150%, and that homeowner says, I'm fine with that, that's fine. You can get down to 150% of the height. If the industry now says, no, we need to be a little closer, we need to be at 110%, the decision-making body then has to consult with the protected land use owner, the property owner where the tower is, the applicant, and the community council to make a decision about whether it's appropriate to get down to 110%.
I was confusing my separation distances.
Okay.
My question goes back all the way to your First Amendment. And if I may just ask it now anyway, you're talking about the distance from residential areas.
Oh, okay.
The
150 feet.
Yes,
Yes.
And as I understood, it's the staff's recommendation that be allowed for height, but it maintains the landscaping and other things, I think you were saying.
That if the assembly wishes to relax that standard somewhat, we would recommend maybe allowing a taller height. So in your residential districts, your height limit is 65 feet. In your commercial districts, it's 130 feet. In your industrial districts, I believe it's 150 feet. And in other districts, I'm not counting a town farm, which is only two of those districts, I believe it's 100 feet. So it seems more reasonable to say, okay, well, if you're within 150 feet of a residential district, you can have a taller tower, but you would still need to have a concealed tower, and the landscaping and fencing of the ground-mounted equipment would have to be consistent with the residential standards.
And is there any flexibility in that landscaping requirement if that zone it's put into is like, it's the back of a Walmart at that point, where having that residential kind of standard doesn't make a lot of sense? I mean, is there any way of looking at that on an individual basis?
Well, under the current code, you'd be required, if you had a Walmart up against residential, you'd be required to have a landscaping buffer there to begin with.
And
We
but
would have
that
to- we would
landscaping
have to
buffer
amend.
wouldn't necessarily cover the cell tower, depending on where it was placed, I would think.
As written, there would not be the flexibility, so it would have to be amended.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Evans, please continue.
Okay, number 12, tower height. This is again about additional height for co-locations. We've already discussed that. 13, I think there was a misunderstanding that we were attempting to model all of our provisions, again, along the lines of the Spokane Code, which was not actually the case, so I just tried to address that. But essentially, this is again about the half-mile separation, and we did propose an amendment, as mentioned earlier. And number 14, again, is a repeat of issue 1.
Thank you. Anything else? No. Okay, so since we have a little bit of time left, I'm going to allow folks in the audience, if anybody has a comment or question, please raise your hand and I'll allow you to ask or make your comment or question. Anyone? Sir? What's your
Yes.
name?
Howard Levine, Jernigan Community Council, member of the Citizens Working Group on the Cell Tower Ordinance Amendment. I was fortunate last week to be able to attend a webinar put on by the FCC, where Chairman Tom Wheeler, no relation, was the leadoff speaker. Excuse me, and there was a couple interesting industry professionals and experts. The guy on subway system self-communication wasn't of much interest to me, but the one guy who talked about the need for increased capacity in residential areas was very interesting. And his take was that the macro sites that were concealed with stealth technology combined with small cell technology and DAS was the future of our providing the capacity that we need. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Becky McPherson from GCI. I think I would just encourage you all to continue to think critically about the question of the extension of the residential standards into non-residential areas, and then also about the possibility of a co-location height incentive. On the first point, I mean, I think that it does build Mr. Evans' point about the landscaping in an adjacent parking lot. I think that when you look at that extension into non-residential areas, it's really three things: it's tower type, it's tower height, and it's the landscaping requirement. And each of those are very specific and stringent in residential areas for specific reasons, to make sure that those towers are shielded and concealed in residential areas. But it starts to lead to, first of all, a real restriction on the use of some of the most most reasonable and most available properties to fill service gaps in residential areas with towers that are outside of those residential areas, where we could fill the taller tower and actually do some productive co-location reaching residential areas, where a tower might be appropriate that it doesn't have the larger landscaping footprint that doesn't have the concealed structure requirement. It would really be appropriate in that area. And then the second is just thinking about the potential for nonsensical results. I mean, a lot of these sites that are right next to residential areas, 8 feet of L1 visual enhancement landscaping and a 150-foot monopine in a parking lot or in a resource extraction facility or adjacent to a restaurant may actually be more obtrusive, more noticeable, more out of place than a standard monopole structure. So those are the kinds of results that we're trying to avoid. And just some flexibility there to consider what might be situationally appropriate in each instance, rather than a one-size-fits-all approach that automatically applies those residential restrictions outside residential areas. And then on the co-location height incentive piece, I agree. We talked about it at length in the committee last summer, and I agree we kind of came to a point of not knowing exactly what to do. But I'm concerned that the response of just shelving that possibility altogether really leaves us open to potentially needing to construct more towers that are shorter, especially with this new focus on stealth structures, which are considerably more difficult to go back and later reverse engineer to be taller. I mean, if we're building stealth pines or stealth, any other type of stealth structure, it's a lot more difficult to go back to that later and try and redo that structure to make it a taller structure if a co-location opportunity comes up. So the two things, the emphasis on shorter towers and emphasis on the stealth structure, we may need to think about how those two fit together to avoid the result of having more short structures next to each other rather than fewer taller structures that have the opportunity for co-location, even if it's not. And the challenge that we, in terms of us not being able to, the industry not being able to guarantee co-location at all times, the challenge we face is just impossible to guarantee that from the life of the tower. Companies buy each other, as we've recently experienced, and new providers come into the market, and people leave structures, and so it really is challenging to say you can only have that height guarantee for the life of the structure, that you will always have this number of carriers on it. There's some flexibility that's needed there, but I think that shelving the whole thing entirely is not the right choice if the goal is to minimize the number of structures rather than having a proliferation of shorter structures.
Thank you. Mr. Melbar?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have two questions for Becky. I apologize that, because of the election, I'm coming in a little bit late on this, so I'm trying to get spun up on everything. But with the co-location height incentive, you mentioned how it's been difficult to do that on stealth towers after the fact. And so I think what you're asking for is the ability to build it taller in the anticipation we might get co-location. Does that only apply to stealth towers? And would that be, if it not, would that be a potential compromise where we give you this ability on the stealth towers, which I assume are more acceptable?
It's always harder to go back and reverse engineer than it is to build a taller tower to begin with, but it's particularly challenging on stealth structures. And I also think this is a particular concern in residential areas where we are going to be building stealth structures in the future and where the height restriction is particularly low. I mean, in some of the other districts where the height restriction is 100, 130 feet, a tower is rarely going to run up against that and for coverage reasons. But I think that would actually be a very good point that with stealth structures in residential areas, if you could have a bump for co-location opportunities provided on the tower, that would serve a good purpose.
So just to be clear about what I was suggesting there, so for the non-stealth towers, they wouldn't have that option. For the stealth towers, they would, because we're more comfortable having the stealth towers go higher in the first place with the hope that they get co-location in the future. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Mr. Gilbert. Thank you, Ms. DeBosi.
Thank you. I just want to make sure, it's been a little while since I've read all of this, but, yeah, and I want to make sure I understand this. So the current S version has residential at 65 feet, but if they can demonstrate anything below 905 feet.
They would have to apply by conditional use.
Okay, so if they were to apply by conditional use, on top of that 95 feet, they still get the federal extension in by program. And it goes taller.
Yes.
So there's really multiple options there.
That's my understanding.
Okay. I was just trying to understand because the tower, and I wish I would have brought my book and I didn't, so I'll bring it for the new members next time, but the tower that I look at my front window is 105 feet, 106 feet. She's got it.
I think you're right, yeah.
Sunmar Court. And I have to be honest with you, like, I haven't even noticed it in the last 2 weeks. I mean, now with leaves on the trees, even without the leaves on the trees, it's really not. So it does give me a little bit of concern going all the way down to 65 feet. In my community, it's very rural, very hilly. So the smaller you go, the less, the signal goes out. So our community council actually asked for Eastside to make that tower taller because they didn't want 2 towers. So our tower's 105 feet. Or 106 feet, just one or the other. But my point is, even the neighbors that were opposed to it, that are like right in the yard, they've actually stopped me at grocery stores and said, "Oh my gosh, actually it's so." So my point is, there's always angst whenever you're building something that large, but I'm very impressed with it. And I have AT&T in my, I have a bar, so it's not even my carrier. But my point is, it's big enough to pull low-key, and that's the thing I think Forrest hit the nail on the head is if we're really trying to minimize the impact to the community, if it means potentially just in residential areas, making them just a little bit taller, so we don't have to have 2 of them, I think the community as a whole would appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. DeBosi. Sir, you got a comment?
Yes, Tim Feller, I'm with South Edition Community Council. So I just want to make one comment that a cell tower we consider to be an industrial device, just as we would not want a sewage lift station or a electrical transformer or any number of refuse disposal site within a residential area. We don't particularly welcome cell phone towers, but the technology is desirable and there are alternatives. But one thing I was just going to propose, and I realize it's late in the game for this, but it would perhaps address this issue of the proliferation of towers, is that we're already seeing a rapid evolution of the technology. Many of these towers that they're using now will be obsolete. Will they abandon them? Most likely, hand them off to a shell company and say it's not ours, we just leased it. So I would propose that maybe we should consider putting a bond issue for the removal of these towers for every tower and every facility that's put up. So that when the technology does evolve, cell phone companies won't be able to walk away and say, not our problem. That there will be sufficient money there for the removal of these towers once they become obsolete, and they will become obsolete.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else?
Heather Nolan, South Edition resident. I've been coming to these meetings from the very beginning, and one thing that I feel like is still a little confusing based on the questions that are asked is the difference between a tower and then the actual antennas. So I just wanted to point out that the top of the Inlet View Towers has a bunch of antennas on that brown band at the top. You just can't see them. And as a resident, that's what we're asking for, is not necessarily having more taller towers, but there is technology out there with this small cell technology to put small panels, these small antenna on top of existing poles or light poles. And so when you're looking at these things, even when we were walking in today and we drove by the Easy Park parking garage, they have these big white panels on this large gray band around the parking garage. If those were painted gray, they wouldn't stick out like a sore thumb. So I just wanted to remind everyone that there are these actual antennas, and then we're talking about towers, when we're talking about these large poles, right? And adding height, to go back to Amy's tower, I saw her book, and she's absolutely right. The tree that they put in her neighborhood, or the camouflage tower, you can't see it. But when we're talking downtown, we don't have 100-foot trees to camouflage these towers. And when we're talking about a 65-foot plus tower outside of our homes, that's significant, because it's these transmission lines. They're not the 45-foot poles. They're already over 65 feet, actually. ML&P admits that they're taller than the 65 feet. They were grandfathered in. So you're talking about these poles that are just predominant anyway, and to add additional height and additional weight or width to it would just be very, I mean, it would just be an eyesore. So I think that that's something to think about too, is that I agree.
Rural and urban too.
Right, rural and urban have huge differences, and I think that these small cell towers and this DAS systems, where these utility poles are linked together already, are really more of a way to look, and that's what the FCC registry about small towers or small cell is talking about as well. And so I really, I appreciate the work and applaud the work that's been done thus far. But really, I think we're starting to talk about towers all the time again, when we should be talking about some of this smaller cell technology that's out there. It's being used in other places. My hometown in Southern California, I see one large monopole tower, and then when I drive by parks, I see small antenna panels on the lights at the parks. Don't see cell towers all littered throughout neighborhoods. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there, that there are ways that we can get around having this proliferation of towers everywhere throughout town.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Hi, Kathy Gleason, I'm not hearing a lot, and there's been so many versions and amendments, and even though I've attended most of the meetings, I'm still scrolling, I have to admit. So is there one source on the website where lay people can go and just have a clear understanding of, in this residential zone, this is allowed, and it's underlined. By right, this is permitted, this is requires for conditional use permit, et cetera, especially for residential. Just lay it all out and no substitutes, underlines, and brackets, so that we know as of today, what's going before the assembly on the 24th, we have a really good feel about what's being proposed as amendments to the current code. That would really be helpful for people like me. Otherwise, there's scrolling around, I'm not even sure what the assessed version reflects the planning and zoning commission's recommendations, or if those are still on a separate piece of paper, and then you've got now your responses to history that now you're seeing for the first time. I'm not even sure what version and what one single document is going before the assembly, and I guess I kind of throw out the question to all assembly members, are you, after this work session, or have you been swimming in them all along, are you going to provide amendments that night? And then how will everybody be able to digest those? And then secondly, it's just always been a big concern of mine in Turnagain about public notice for residents and community councils when these things are put forth, the application is submitted. And I'm still hoping that this code, the final version of this code, has a requirement that community councils and people, frankly, I think it should be within 1,000 feet residents, but even the 500 distance, that they receive notice of any proposed, and I don't care whether it's small cell tower, DAS, small cell, DAS, if it's allowed under administrative review, requires a conditional use permit, we all get notified, and we know what is being proposed in our neighborhood, so that we could respond appropriately, we feel like we.
Thank you, Ms. Andowski and then Mr. Schramm.
My understanding is the S version is the version we're gonna be considering. I mean, the regular version is also noticed, but the table of uses is in there right now. And so, that's where I would look first, Kathy.
Does that reflect P and Z commissions?
Yes, yes. So I think this is the most updated, has everything incorporated that we're gonna be considering. I can tell you as far as amendments go, one of the amendments that Erica was helping me with has already been incorporated. I might have one.
Not in the S version. It's incorporated in that.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So if you're looking for amendments that might be proposed, I would grab this little 7-page packet. So, you know, with that, I might have one other amendment, but it's basically on process.
Mr. Duffy, Mr. Training?
The S version is in front of us here. This will be the document we'll work on. As to what others, amendments members have, we have no idea until we get to the meeting and then present. So we're going to, this is the document we're going to work on. It does have easy.
Thank you, Mr. Training, Mr. Dunbar, and then Mr. Reynolds.
So I think I actually have a similar question to the audience member, and I think you might have just answered it, so sort of a process question. So someone in Evans, for example, came up with an idea for an amendment, talking with this discussion, so did I. Is there going to be more work from the administration, another version before the 24th, or the assumption is the only way to get changed at this point is actual?
Actually, have to bring an amendment with you to the Sunday meeting for closing. This is the S version, we're not going to do an S1 version.
I'd be happy to help you draft an amendment if you like.
Thank you.
Thank you. And before I go to Mr. Weddleton, I am going to ask my colleagues, if you have any minutes, to submit them to the clerk on Friday before the meeting, so that we can get them posted on the internet, so that our community can see what they are before Tuesday evening. I think that's appropriate. Right. I think, will that work, Ms. Jones? Absolutely. Thank you. Mr. Weddleton?
That was my answer.
Okay, thank you, Jake. Okay, I don't see any, sir?
Yes, Ken Lyons, personal officer on behalf of AT&T. Thank you for this opportunity to comment. And I would just say that these regulations, they obviously have a very significant impact on we believe, at least on behalf of AT&T, I won't speak on behalf of the other carriers, but we believe this has a significant impact on our ability to provide quality wireless service to the Anchorage community. And so that's why we're here proposing these things. We're not opposed to having well-integrated sites that are stealth, but we are concerned about certain things like being able to achieve the right height. You know, certainly a 65-foot pole, if it's a stealth structure, your antennas aren't actually at 65 feet. Because if you want it to look like a real tree, you have to have a little cone on top, right? So your antennas are actually lower than that. So it's an example of, you know, if you have a 60-foot tall structure and it's next to 70-foot tall trees, it's not going to provide meaningful coverage. So it's very important that we have the opportunity to make sure that we are able to get the appropriate height. And then I think that when you couple that with the requirement that co-location occur, I think that you will get the desired result. If you build a facility that's tall enough to begin with, and again, these things are not easily extendable because again, they're stealth. They are they're meant to blend in with the surrounding. When you accompany that with the requirement to co-locate, I think you will see the intended result that those become really the first option that all carriers have to look at before any other new tower or structure is proposed. And then just a couple more thoughts. For AT&T, we are not opposed to having a small cell technology. We've advocated for workable standards. Certainly, we've suggested that the FCC definitions for the antenna size as well as equipment be adopted. The concern, though, is that we do not believe that it serves as a functional replacement for the macro facilities that we have in our network. It might provide, we might have opportunities to supplement that, but we believe that there's support is going to continue for the near and long term to have a functional macro site network. So that's the reason why we have this concern about being required to put perhaps small cell in an area where it actually functionally will not work with what is being proposed. So anyway, in short, we do support the additional height in residential areas for, especially considering that they are stealth structures, and especially considering that there are opportunities to require co-location from other carriers. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Mr. Evans?
Just quickly, thank you, Madam Chair. I did want to respond to the woman's comment about the small cell technology and stuff. And our body is, overflowing with lawyers these days, but very few electrical engineers. So this has been sort of a learning experience for all of us as to the network of how these things work. That was one of the issues I looked into. It seems like if you're going to have small cells, well, let's just have small cells. But as best as I can determine, it is sort of one of the things we're facing is that our macro network is not completely filled out yet. And that, like in Southern California, where it probably is, small cell technology is a lot more easily used. Here we have some opportunities, but not for every case. And that's why I think the incentives are right here. We do incentivize those uses and the stealth uses wherever possible, but we have to realize that sometimes in order to get that service, we're not going to have one of those options. And I do want to say I am concerned about, at least from my area on the hillside, where we have a lot of tall trees, and we can have very tall stealth towers that aren't a problem visually, that by limiting them to the 65-foot amount and kind of reducing the chances of co-location, we're actually kind of hurting our ability to keep cell towers at a minimum. I can see in other areas of town that may be more problematic, but certainly there are some areas of our town where I think the 65-foot limit is actually cutting against the goal we have starting this of making these towers as invisible as possible and as few as possible. So I will explore some sort of amendment on that, so there'll be something on that coming forward, but just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Mr. Train and Mr. Middleton.
Barbara, if we've made copies available for the amendment form to the Assembly members, we've got new colors on the body, and let them know it needs to be typed. If you don't take handwritten. Just want to make sure, because it's easier if they know ahead of time we want it typed, not just hand described.
Do I have to use a typewriter?
No, it's typewriter.
I didn't know you knew what a typewriter was in the grade.
3 carbon copies.
I used it once in college.
Smithsonian's always a good place to find one. I'd appreciate that, Barbara. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Train. Let me just add to that, okay, besides the typing, I want to make sure that everybody gets their amendments in Friday before, so that Ms. Jones, who agreed that it's doable, can post them on the internet, so our community can see what our amendments are before we're on before. Thank you. Mr. Weddleton and then Mr. Peterson.
Eric, did you consider Class B versus Class A area rules to kind of deal with the hillside,
No,
rivers?
the 65-foot height limit is what's been in code for some time, and we didn't explore changing it. But you're all saying.
Anything else, Mr. Weddleton?
No, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was wondering if someone from industry could talk a little bit about the frequency of your particular cell phones. And I understand that some frequencies work better at different heights than others. And I think it would be educational for everyone if someone could go into that in a little bit more detail.
I'd be happy to. So obviously the federal government has auctioned off frequencies for us to use. Generally speaking, lower frequency bands, those would be like 700 megahertz to 850. In that range, it actually has pretty good propagation. In other words, the towers don't have to be as close together in order to get good coverage. More recently, they have been auctioning off much higher bands, up to 1900, 2100, 2300, 2500 megahertz, where it's much higher frequency, and the signals just don't travel as far. And they're also much more prone to interference from things like trees or from buildings, and they have more difficulty being able to provide safe coverage into somebody in their house, right? Because it won't be able to go through the wall. So these are all the things that the RF engineers have to consider when they are trying to decide where a site needs to go, and being able to serve customers with all the frequencies that the licenses have been purchased to be able to provide that.
And I would add to that, I mean, one of the reasons you maybe have seen more projects or more conversation about GCI projects in recent years is because we actually own, because of the time that we entered the wireless market and the relative resources we have as a local provider versus a national company, we own less of that lower frequency band of that we are able to operate, and as such, we generally have to build towers that are a little closer together, a little taller to actually allow our frequency to reach customers in comparison with, like, for instance, my understanding of AT&T wants more of that low frequency gas, which has, leads to different conclusions of where and how frequently you need to build a tower.
So in short, she's advocating to go at a lower height for AT&T than.
Oh, yeah.
Anything else, Mr. Peterson?
No, thank you, I appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson, Mr. Flynn.
Yeah, and I know this would be damaging to your marketing campaigns, but is there any possibility of a blended network where the carriers, pool their resources and utilize the array of licenses that are available to the 4 companies?
Discussing what I think we're actually prevented from doing explicitly what you're suggesting under federal law. There are a number of nuances to what you're saying. We definitely there are roaming agreements between carriers that allow one carrier to roam on the other's frequency. There are various derivations of that where there are different pieces of infrastructure are shared. With co-location being at one end where we have physically different radios that are attached to the same structure, and then roaming being at the other end where we're broadcasting another carrier's signal on our network, and then other iterations in between. But I think collusion or collaboration to provide only one network alternative, I think is presented as an anti-competitive.
If I can add, co-location, however, we all have national agreements with each other to use each other's infrastructure. So to be able to go on a tower, we already have preset terms and rates, and to make the process really to encourage exactly what the discussion has been here today to encourage, and that is to share these infrastructure as well, instead of having to build new towers to be able to provide basically coverage for a different network. So that's certainly an example where there's a lot of cooperation in the industry to do that. And co-location, I think was mentioned before, it really is the default first option from the cost reason why you certainly want to deploy your network as efficiently as possible, and certainly using others' infrastructure makes sense.
Thank you. Anything else, Mr. Flynn?
Can I ask a question?
Thank you, Mr. Flynn.
I don't believe you all own all of your infrastructure, is that correct? I know that we get applications from tower companies that just build towers. Do you have those agreements with those companies as well?
Yes. So all the national tower companies, the Crown Castles, American Towers, places like that, we have agreements with them, I believe. Correct.
I don't think any of those companies make this offer.
They do. There are tower company towers that are constructed, or towers that have companies that have purchased towers from carriers who built them originally in Anchorage. Definitely, there are. I believe there are Atlas towers, and there are American towers in Anchorage, and the other providers that have towers in Anchorage.
I'll say it more clearly like this: if there's any tower, even if it's not owned by one of the major tower companies, for AT&T's perspective, we will contact that owner to see if we can co-locate, regardless of whether or not we have preset terms with them or not. And certainly, the requirement is, looking at co-location as the first option is a very common type of requirement you do see in other jurisdictions, and we adhere to it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Collins, Mr. Evans.
Yeah, I'm sorry for a late question, Madam Chair, but it's coming in this gentleman's kind of concern about, these structures once they become obsolete, and I think that's a reasonable concern. And we're now burying all these overhead lines because, we can and we don't want them overhead. At some point, these towers are going to be probably obsolete and unnecessary. Has there been any thought given to somehow creating some system whereby there is a requirement that if you build the tower, once it's unused for any certain period of time, you're responsible for dismantling and taking it away?
There are abandonment provisions in the section on page 21, and basically it says if the any antenna or power structure that is not operated for a continuous period of 12 months shall be considered abandoned, and the owner has to remove it within 180 days of receiving notice.
Saying that'd be the owner of the tower.
Or the antenna, if it was the antenna by itself. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. McDonald. Thank you, Mr. Evans. Mr. Reynolds?
Well, maybe following up on that, when, there's a line in here that says if something goes lines underground, and then they have to take their antenna off. But in some places where the underground you got electric, MLP have to underground, but the cable companies and phone companies don't have to. So they chop off.
They do have to.
Well, you're right, what
We are not
properties they
enforcing
chop
it.
them off.
Yeah, we have not been enforcing it, but they are required to go underground unless they can prove that going underground would cost more than 2% of their gross annual revenues. It's an enforcement issue.
John, we're actually, Elby and I are sending a letter to the cable, to the telecommunications companies today, reinstating the law that requires them to underground. And every assembly member's got a copy of it today. We're actually gonna be pushing this because the requirement is within the short time period, they underground. Because the way it is right now, let's say
That's 100 years.
ML&P undergrounds, where they cut off the pole. Telecommunications companies responsible for the rest of the lines to underground. They're never gonna do it. Because once ML&P has dug up the dirt and covered over again, the cost is extremely high to open dirt up again. So we, and Erica was good enough to write us a letter citing city code. We intend to pursue this.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton, thank you, Mr. Trey, and to the industry, ACS and GCI, you may want to let your clients know that there's a certified letter coming.
It's on their way today.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you, everybody, for being here. Work session is adjourned.